Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Angela Jones from Monash Partners. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today. Monash Partners is very pleased to be bringing this event with Sydney Health Partners. This is an example of a collaboration across our two centres. On behalf of Angela, Todd and the team at Sydney Health Partners, we're really delighted that you can join us today for our webinar. We've got a stellar range of speakers and we're going to be focusing on consumer and community involvement in clinical trials, the practical strategies and some of the lessons learned. We begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today. We acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us for this webinar, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their connection to the land, and elders past, present and emerging. A little bit of an overview of our program for today. We've got a range of great speakers, consumers, researchers, clinicians, all with experience in this space and here to share their learnings and their insights. Anthony Brown will be kicking off with an overview of the consumer perspective and some introductory comments. Helena Teed will be talking about the work that's happening at a national level under the collaboration of centres like Monash Partners and Sydney Health Partners. Leonie Young and Ben Horgan here to provide the consumer perspective about the importance of meaningful engagement. Heath Badger is going to speak about consumer and community involvement in the life of a clinical trial, and Nicola Stratton around some of the work that ACTA has been leading. And then we'll have some examples of work that's been underway in some of our health services, particularly around the clinical trials governance framework, but also in the context of intensive care. And Peter Murphy will provide an industry perspective. We will have some time for a panel discussion and there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. Just before we move on, to highlight some of the resources in consumer and community involvement that are available. Some online resources and modules that Monash Partners have developed and are available on our website. Also a joint position statement on consumer and community involvement developed by the National Collaboration ARA and the Consumers Health Forum. Some work that was led back in 2018 on a national survey of CCI across Australia. A best practice handbook, which will be soon released by the Western Australian Health Translation Network, and some work that Monash Partners has been doing with Sphere around developing a national knowledge hub in CCI. We'd encourage you to please use the Q&A for questions during the session. We'll keep track of those. If there's one that you'd like to prioritise, you can do that by giving it a thumbs up, just to let you know that we're audio and recording the session, and we will circulate a summary of the key points after the session. I'm going to stop sharing, and it's now my great pleasure to hand over to Dr. Anthony Brown. Anthony is the Executive Director of Consumer Health Forum, and he's just going to provide some Health Consumers New South Wales, my apologies, and Anthony's going to provide a little bit of context and some opening remarks today. Anthony, over to you. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Angela. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Before I start, of course, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands that we're meeting on. I'm on Gadigal land, and I acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. And I also acknowledge Aboriginal ways of understanding health and First Nations understanding of engagement in decision making and the communal nature of decision making. I think going beyond acknowledgements, it's important to understand that there's a lot that we can learn from First Nations understanding around decision making and health. And I think engagement is really at the pointy end of where we can learn from First Nations experiences. As Angela said, I'm from Health Consumers New South Wales. We're the peak consumer organisation for health consumers and people who use health services in New South Wales. And our aim and our reason for existence is to promote and practice consumer involvement and engagement with health services and researchers, and work to ensure that the consumer perspective is heard and taken into account. Before I start, I just want to make the point that language is really important here, and that I think it's important that we acknowledge when it comes to this area of involving consumers in research, that this language is contested, and that people use the term involvement, engagement, participation, partnership. Sometimes they use those words to mean the same things. Sometimes they use them to mean different things. And sometimes there's confusion between what we would call, when we use terms like engagement, and other people think we're talking about participation and recruitment. So I think it's really important at the start of events like this that we make it really clear that we're talking about, when we talk about engagement, we're talking about processes and ways to actively involve the public and consumers in the priority setting, question development, methodological choices, and governance structures of research. So why is it important to bring consumers into this? Well, there's growing evidence that I'm sure many people on the call are aware of how when we bring consumers and community members into these decision-making processes, we get better outcomes. Not just better outcomes for consumers and communities, but we also get outcomes that are more easily translatable and more easily used by other stakeholders in the system. Also, at the heart of this, there's a growing understanding that this is a human rights issue, and that democracy, that this is involvement is part of participatory processes and participatory democracy that more and more of us are interested in. And of course, there's the practical consideration that funding bodies and journals are now expecting that consumers and community members will be involved. And most importantly, I think there's growing consumer and patient expectations that we will be involved and we will be doing this. Of course, today we're talking particularly about clinical trials, but of course, there's many areas that we need to look at beyond clinical trials. And I just want to, I suppose, raise that the issues of building everybody's capacity to work together, the importance of training for consumers and researchers in working together, the importance of incorporating learning and training about participatory methodologies into students, undergraduate and postgraduate training is also something we need to look at, and also to make sure that we create more opportunities like today where consumers and researchers with an interest in engagement can come together, share our understandings, and start to really see that this is a new and emerging discipline that needs all of our attention. So thank you again for your time, and I'm really excited to be here and part of today. And back to Angela. And
Anthony, thank you so much for your introductory comments and for setting the scene for us today. We really appreciate it. It's my pleasure now to introduce Helena Teed. Helena is the Executive Director of Monash Partners and was the inaugural chair of the Australian Health Research Alliance. And Helena is just going to speak with us for a few minutes today about ARA and the work that it's leading. And I'm just about to share a slide, Helena. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks very much, Anthony. I think one of the key things about the Australian Health Research Alliance, for those of you who are not aware, is that this is basically a national alliance across all of the NHMRC accredited research translation centres. And the critical thing about these centres is they're about doing things differently. We have to acknowledge that the community are the funders of research and should ultimately be the beneficiaries of research. We are also the funders of healthcare and the beneficiaries of healthcare in Australia. And up until recently, the community, whether we call ourselves patients, consumers, or whatever term we use, the reality is we've had little say as end users in the way the health system's designed and also the way research is designed, delivered and translated. And as as Anthony has suggested, this is really a social justice issue. It's pretty clear that the old paradigm of simply looking at research and even clinical trials as something that can only be delivered from the perspective of an academic or an expert is a relatively naive paradigm, and that we need to have all of the key stakeholders on board to actually be able to understand the problems, to then develop the solutions and make sure those solutions are fit for purpose for translation. So just in terms of the Alliance itself, which is bringing together all of these centres around the country, and you can see the map there of where we all are. This is a national initiative, and under that we have 4 key areas we work together, and one of our most important is consumer and community involvement, and that means true participation the way that Anthony's described it, not simply as participation as a trial participant, but in the whole journey and process. We also work on data-driven healthcare improvement. We do a number of other initiatives that have come up as high priority. We have a strong national Indigenous research capacity building network. We also focus on other areas that have become national priorities, including women's health and aged care. And that collaboration has been very strong and has worked on the principle of equity and social justice as well. Basically, the excellence in research should not just sit in particular areas, but should be shared outside academia with the community and with our health services. Thank you, Angela.
Thanks, Helena. It's really terrific to provide that context about the national environment in which we're working, and I guess to reassure people that we are working to provide a coordinated approach to consumer involvement in research. It's my pleasure to now introduce our first speaker. Sorry, my notes have just disappeared. Leonie. I'm very pleased to invite Leonie Young, who is from the Australian and New Zealand Urogenital and Prostate Cancer Trials Group, to give us some, insights into working with consumers from her experiences. So welcome, Leonie.
Thank you very much for having, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about this really important topic that I've been associated for a very long time. When I was diagnosed with breast cancer way back in 1987, the concept of consumer engagement, along with many of the key cancer organisations, either really didn't exist or in the process of developing. So I was able to be a part of the change, and this was a really great learning space for me to gain experience and knowledge. The cancer domain, has been one of the leaders in consumer engagement. So I, in a strange way, I consider myself quite fortunate, really, to have been part of this, because I believe that there's a great advantage in appreciating where we came from as to understanding appreciating what is happening now. So there's going to be 3 themes running through this presentation that I believe are really key to successful consumer engagement. One of those principles is engaging well with consumers is to avoid just ticking the box. And so very often this may occur because maybe lack of resources and lack of time, or training for new researchers, not knowing where to find the right consumers, and just simply not knowing how to go about it. Another key consideration is the notion that not one size fits all. And so we see examples so many times where just because someone's had a particular diagnosis, they get invited to be the consumer. But sadly, sometimes they just don't have the understanding or the experience or knowledge or any concept of what their role might be. So I'm saying you just can't pull a name out of the hat and expect or assume that it's going to work well. And the third one is how people with the lived experience are referenced. And I'll use the term consumer today because it's the term most used, but to be perfectly honest, it's not one of my favourite, but it's one that we all know, and it's not my favourite because sometimes it does get misused. But like many others, I really don't know what a good alternative might be. But healthcare consumers describes the healthcare consumer as anyone who uses, has used, or may use any health or health-related service. But this is where some of the confusion begins. a consumer might be an experienced consumer advocate or consumer member of a study team. They could be a potential study participant or patient, and they could be just someone in the general community who's interested in fundraising for research, or a member of a support group, or even a focus group. None are incorrect, because we are all consumers of the health system. And so a potential trial participant or patient, however, has a very different role to a consumer member who's part of the study team, contributing to the decisions about the study. Health professionals are advocates as well for patients, but they're not patient and consumer advocates in the context we're discussing today. So, you know, very different roles, but we're all referenced as consumers. A recent article I read about patient roles quoted a paper by Margaret Anderson and Kay Kimberly McCleary, and it was titled From Passengers to Co-Pilots. And I just thought it's a really great description of the consumer role in research and how it's evolved and changed over the years. So, you know, to any consumer advocates who might be in the audience, I say there's an aspect of responsibility, and be careful what you wish for in this, because there's just been so much work and advocacy around the importance of the consumer perspective that the onus is really on us as co-pilots to make sure that we undertake our roles professionally and uphold the good reputation of others. And this is where that knowledge of the history of consumer engagement is really helpful. In 2011, Cancer Australia produced the National Framework for Consumer Involvement in Cancer Control. And it's still really relevant today. And as an example, and as a great example of really practicing what you preached, this body of work included a large group of clinicians, researchers, policymakers, and consumer advocates. In fact, one of the chairs was a consumer, but he was well suited for the role because he was experienced and knowledgeable. This work identified 4 key components for successful consumer engagement. It was committed organisations, capable consumers, inclusive groups, and a shared focus. And it identified some really important issues here. And the first one really is around champions. And consumer advocates need champions and leaders in organisations for our voices to be heard in the first place and to get our foot in the door. And it's important for that successful consumer involvement. It wouldn't have occurred without people doing that and still doing that for us and making sure that our voices are there. Mutual respect ensures that all contributions and opinions are valued, especially the consumers. Consumers are expert by experience, so through mutual respect, we need to be considered equal members of the team through that perspective that we bring. And professionals and consumers can learn from each other's knowledge and experience, and this can happen when they undertake professional development opportunities together. And of course, mindful and respectful communication means that we all communicate in a way that builds this knowledge and understanding and mutual respect. So it's really important to understand the different ways that consumer advocates provide input and where and how their input can be utilised. And you might have seen this trail before of all, many, some, few, and I like to use it often to explain this because everybody has had an experience with the health system, so we all have an opinion about it. Many people are available as volunteers, they give general feedback, they fill out surveys. Trained consumers are, you know, there's some of us do that and take on that role, extra engagement and extra responsibility. And there's very few really who are experienced and trained and are involved in more in research decisions and planning and have more input around those sorts of research examples. Leonard Quiche said, if patient engagement were a drug, it would be a blockbuster drug of the century and malpractice not to use it. But, you know, there definitely are some challenges, and especially when it's related to science and research, it's a very valid concern to ask, you know, how can a layperson understand the science and how can they possibly contribute at this level? So the consistent message really is that consumers bring a perspective of their diagnosis and experience, something that's unique to them and their lived experience. They also bring a wealth of diversity and knowledge and capabilities, but above all, they bring that motivation for improving outcomes and the ability to ground research in the lived reality. So what should consumer engagement look like? Well, consumer engagement is not tokenistic, only completed with a few people or easy to reach, using the same few voices to represent an entire community, and certainly not a single process. So I've included some do's in here that might be helpful. So I'm saying do connect with consumers on a regular basis for updates and feedback. This could be, simply over a cup of coffee or through email updates or invitations to your laboratories to see your work or your place of work. It's not a hard process. Invite questions and feedback about research policy directions. Develop a rapport with individuals who you can communicate with regularly and who will give honest and considered feedback. And we're talking about a tick box here. And the thing to remember is that the tick box thing works both ways, because researchers want to work with consumers who will take the time to consider their requests and provide helpful feedback in a very professional way. They don't want someone who's just going to tick the box without really undertaking their role properly and not reading the work and providing that input that they've been asked to. Ask for input around developing community communications. That's a really simple way to do it. Where possible and appropriate, include consumers on steering committees and as associate investigators. And this isn't always necessary and it's not always possible, but where it is, I think it's really a great way to acknowledge the work that's done. Let consumer representatives know how your grant application has gone and whether it's been successful or not, because a conscientious consumer representative will have invested a lot of time into the application success or otherwise, and we're really interested to know how it's gone. Invite them for feedback and help in writing a summary. So we might not be scientists and understand the science, but this is one place where an informed consumer worth their salt should be able to be most helpful. And so if you're not asking them for feedback in this area, then you're missing a really great opportunity. And as a consumer reviewer of grant applications, I can tell you this makes a big difference in how your application is considered. And experienced consumer reviewers know what good practice looks like, and it's quite noticeable whether a consumer representative's input is being utilised well or not. So some of the don'ts, and sadly I didn't make these up, they are for real. So don't say you knew someone once who had whatever, breast cancer. This isn't a consumer perspective. Don't say you used to connect with a consumer in your last job and intend to do so in the future. Don't tell them your ideas at the beginning and then just don't contact them again and keep them updated. Don't assume that the consumer doesn't understand the concepts, because what I've been saying is that the right person for the role will have the education and the background understanding about the issues. And of course, don't just tick the box. So just in summing up, consumer engagement is about education, experience, knowledge, developing networks, matching the person to fit the role, and training. And that's how you're going to get the person to fit the role to do a good job. And it's about, ticking the right box for the right person. So when you have the right role for the consumer, then the contributions can be enormous and so valuable. People may simply need a bit of encouragement to get started and to start slowly and to find where their niche is. Everyone has a role to play to make a difference, and the right role for the right person will certainly just make all the difference. And in closing, I'd like to just leave you with this quote by Bill Bradley, who said, "Respect your fellow human beings, treat them fairly, disagree with them honestly, enjoy their friendship, explore your thoughts about one another candidly, work together for a common goal, and help one another achieve it."
Thanks so much, Leonie. What a wonderful opening presentation from you. And clearly you've got a lot of experience that you've shared with our group. So thank you so much. I guess one of the messages that a strong message that I got from your presentation was around the importance of the diversity of consumers, and that you really need to think very carefully about the kinds of consumer involvement you want and the kinds of consumers you want. Those are two different things. And also the value of investing in relationships with consumers for the longer term.
Absolutely.
I can certainly say that that's how our work with Health Consumers New South Wales has been going. You know, we're in this for the long term, and our work with Anthony Brown and Health Consumers New South Wales is really building a great relationship. So thank you. It's my pleasure to now introduce our second consumer speaker, Ben Horgan. Ben and I and Angela Jones and many of us on this call have worked together through the translation centres across Australia. Ben is the Consumer and Community Involvement Coordinator for the West Australian Health Translation Network. And a very warm welcome, Ben. I know it's early hours for you in WA, so thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Angela. It's a pleasure to be here and speaking with you this morning. I think it's still this morning over there. Yeah, it is. So, look, I'm here to talk to you about a global experience that I've had as a consumer working with a clinical trials group called OMERACT. So OMERACT is an organisation that strives to improve endpoint outcome measurement through a data-driven, iterative consensus process involving relevant stakeholder groups, including consumers. The term OMERACT, it was actually originally established back in 1992 and originally stood for Outcome Measures in Rheumatoid Arthritis Clinical Trials. Since then, the OMERACT initiative has turned into an even bigger informal network with working groups and gatherings interested in outcome measurement across the spectrum of rheumatology intervention studies. And so the acronym has now broadened to stand for Outcome Measures in Rheumatology. I was initially invited to become part of the OMERACT group back in 2002 when they were holding a conference in America. I have been lucky enough to be, involved in research since my early childhood, thanks to my mum's interest in making sure that she knew as much about juvenile arthritis as possible and helping others to know as much as they could as well. So what happened was I had this invitation to go to America. I'm not sure whether I was going to be able to contribute properly, even though I'd had a bit of involvement in research before, but it was a little bit overwhelming to go to a global conference and feel like I could actually add any value to the conversation. But it was a trip to America, so I couldn't exactly say no. When I got there, the first session that I was involved with was looking at defining flares in rheumatoid arthritis, something that I'd had several of by that stage. So I felt like I had a lived experience, but wasn't sure how I was going to be able to contribute. The research team had decided to design the session in a way that gave patients an opportunity to be able to contribute, and the clinicians and researchers that were there an opportunity as well. We were actually separated into two rooms, so there was 12 consumers involved in the session at the conference actually, so 12 consumers in a small room, and then the rest of the researchers and clinicians were in another room, quite a bit larger. There was about 180 of them. Not overwhelming at all. So what they did is that they gave us some de-identified data. So this data was taken from the core set that was being used at the time, and they were literally just small cards with numbers written on them. So we had scores for a patient global, there was a physician global, there was a quality of life measure, there was some blood work, and there was also a number of inflamed joints. That's all we had. So we had a card with those scores on them. We had no idea of who the person was, where they were from, how long they had had their disease, or any information that we felt as patients would have been quite relevant to deciding whether these people were in flare or not. That's all we had to do, make two piles. This person's in flare, this person isn't. So we spent quite a bit of time actually trying to figure out how we would do this and what sort of process we would go through to make an educated decision. And that probably took the longest time of the whole session. But eventually we came up with a process and we used that process to basically make a decision, yes or no, going through the cards one at a time. And we did that. We had 2 piles in the end, and we finished the session a little bit confused. Obviously, each of us had a different understanding of what flare meant to us. Arthritis is one of those conditions where it is as individual as you are. So to be able to come up with the answers in this were quite confronting. Anyway, we went through the process, and the clinicians, researchers were doing exactly the same thing with exactly the same cards. And they gave their cards back to the research group, who went away for a short amount of time to analyse the results of these piles that we had put together, and then came back. So the whole group came together in the main hall, and they approached the stage with a little bit of a disappointed look on their face, I must say. But they proceeded to let the whole group know that they were very appreciative of the time that we spent doing this exercise. But in the end, it probably didn't come to much, because the patients and the researchers pretty much came up with 2 totally different groups, or 2 totally different results, which in hindsight probably wasn't surprising. So the initial discussion was around how we actually came up with these results, and what was the process that we went through. And the process really was a prioritisation process. So we had to decide which of those scores meant the most to us. And in the end, the patients decided that the quality of life score was the most important as far as coming up with the results. So we felt quite strongly that if your quality of life was good, then it was highly unlikely that you would actually be in flare. We felt that quality of life was the first thing that flare took away, and all of the other results didn't necessarily correlate to a flare. The clinicians, on the other hand, prioritised quite differently. So they felt that the number of inflamed joints and also the blood work were the most relevant to deciding whether somebody was in flare. And I think it came down to the fact that we just look at things in a different way. So patients understand the day-to-day dealings of arthritis and how impactful it can be and how unpredictable it can be, whereas clinicians and researchers, they like things to be a little bit black and white. And obviously number of inflamed joints and blood work is quite black and white. So they decided that that was the way to go. That generated a lot more discussion. And in the end, we just agreed to disagree. Both of us felt very strongly about the fact that our process was the most appropriate. But even though we disagreed, we understood that both points of view were highly relevant to this discussion. And in the end, it almost validated the fact that patients needed to be involved in these discussions. Otherwise, the entire understanding of the question at hand wouldn't be entered into. And you wouldn't have all the relevant stakeholders involved in the discussion to be able to enable you to come up with something that was tangible and relevant to not only the clinicians, but particularly to the patients who this research was actually supposed to be helping. So it was a terrific discussion, even though it didn't come up with the results that the researchers want. And looking at the work that I've done since, it's actually quite common for consumers to come to the table and enter into the discussion with things that actually make the work more difficult, harder, but far more relevant, I must say. And I think that OMRACT example is quite a good way to describe how that can work. From there, at that conference, we had a look at all of the different course sets that had been developed. Some of them we didn't understand and could even pronounce. But one of the consumers who were at the conference picked up on something that was actually missing. That was fatigue. We weren't measuring fatigue at all in any clinical trials to do with inflammatory arthritis. And we felt that this was a glaring gap in the knowledge that we were trying to utilise to understand whether trials were successful or not. So we challenged the researchers to go away and find a way to measure fatigue. And it was difficult because there's a lot of languages out there that don't have a word for fatigue, and even defining fatigue was quite contentious because people describe it in so many different ways. But eventually, 8 years later, actually, research takes time to do it properly. But 8 years later, the research team from the UK came back with a validated tool, which is now being used not only across inflammatory arthritis and through the OMERACT process, but in all sorts of other diseases and situations. So OMERACT has been very good to me. I've been able to be involved in many different projects, including redefining the juvenile arthritis core set, which was updated in just the last couple of years. I've continued to work in the FLARES group. I've been involved in a health literacy group through OMERACT and a pain working group as well. It's a terrific organisation. We have consumers involved at an executive level. The technical advisory group, which actually helps researchers to understand how to work within OMERACT and use the resources that have been developed, has 2 consumers on board. One of those I'm lucky enough to be. And it really has helped me and many other consumers and many research projects to actually come up with some amazing resources that are being used across inflammatory arthritis globally. And it has also helped me to do the work here in Australia through the Western Australian Health Translation Network and the Consumer and Community Involvement Program to support local researchers to involve consumers to achieve the best outcomes for the people who they're actually trying to help, and include many consumers along the way. So just a quick story. I'm a bit of a storyteller for those who know me. I appreciate the time to be able to present today and appreciate this workshop. I think it's a terrific topic, and I look forward to hearing more throughout this morning. Thanks very much, Angela.
Thanks, Ben. What a great personal story, and really great to hear all of the different ways that both you personally and the organisation have been able to influence research in the rheumatology area. I think I need to, you might need to become a doctor as well as a consumer by the sounds of things. Thanks again, Ben. It's now my pleasure to introduce Heath Badger. Heath is the Chief Operating Officer for the Breast Cancer Trials Group, and Heath's going to tell us a little bit about the way that consumers can be involved in the life of a clinical trial. Thanks, Heath.
So thank you for the opportunity. Like us, the introduction, integrating community and consumer involvement with clinical trials. Just in the interest of time, I'll try and get through the presentation. As an overview, I'll be looking at presenting why we do it, how we do it, and what it would actually look like. And I'll be doing that from the perspective of BCT, being a large-ish collaborative, cooperative clinical trials group. In looking at the question why, it's an important place to start because it's a multifaceted question. Why is such a simple 3-letter word, but it generates an endless multitude of answers. And it really depends on, I suppose, how you phrase the question. Why should you, or why you should? If we look at it from the perspective of why should you, there are many reasons, and I won't go into those today. There are far more experienced and educated individuals on this panel who could certainly answer that question better than I could. But just as an example of reasons why, it's doing the research that matters. And a purist will argue that all research matters, and to some extent that's true, but meaningful research in the context of health and health research is research that impacts the lives of the sufferers. And you only get that understanding through consumers and those people with the lived experience. And another reason is it makes the research easier. I'll caveat that by saying that, yes, it takes some time and effort to set up a good engagement platform, but if you are engaged with consumers and the community and you're asking the questions that they want answered in ways that they can answer it, you increase the chance of successfully completing your research trial. And it might be in things like succeeding in terms of recruitment, minimising your dropouts of participants, and minimising non-compliance. All of those things that as clinical trialists you dread occurring in your research program. And engaging with consumers early in the process can help to eliminate those possibilities from occurring. If we were to look at it from the perspective of why you should, then that becomes the perspective of the individual or the individual research organisation. And if you already know the reasons why you should involve researchers in your research or your research program, then that's good. But if the reason is something like because funders said you need consumers, then that's not the reason. And let's just assume you haven't got that bedded down yet and you're joining this session from a fresh start. Consumer and community engagement needs to be holistic and not just a simple increase of recruitment or ticking a box, as Leonie's mentioned earlier today. You know, these might be outcomes of the process, but they shouldn't be the driver for a good engagement platform. So assuming you know the reasons why you would like consumer engagement in your program, that's great, but I would just caution not to be blinkered in that approach and not limit your possibilities for opportunities. And hopefully some of the presentations today will provide some insight and inspiration around some of those additional opportunities. From BCT's perspective, our consumer and community involvement really comes back to those two things that I mentioned up the top. It's really conducting the research that matters to the lives of the sufferers, and it's making our clinical trials relevant and easy to conduct. In terms of how you go about integrating consumer and community involvement varies based on the type of research organisation you are and the research you're undertaking. You know, is the research condition specific, like breast cancer, or does it bridge multiple diseases and disease states? Are you only conducting one research trial, or are you developing a research program or portfolio of continuous trials? I mean, these considerations will lead to decisions around whether you look at establishing a standalone consumer community representative group for your organisation, or whether you potentially go to established organisations that are looking to partner with researchers, such as Health Consumers New South Wales or Cancer Voices Australia. From the BCT's perspective, we have, I suppose, two primary modes of consumer and community engagement, and they are our Consumer Advisory Panel, or CAP, and our Impact Program. However, we do partner with other organisations, you know, when we need to or when there's an opportunity to. Networks like the NBCF, you know, have strong consumer representation within the community. And so we will engage with those networks where we need to bolster and improve the research program that we're looking to undertake. In terms of the Consumer Advisory Panel, just a brief overview of that. The Breast Cancer Trials Board established the Consumer Advisory Panel in 1998 because it recognised the value and importance of consumer input in planning and conducting clinical trials research. The CAP has multiple or quite a number of aims, and I've just summarised you know, 4 key ones there, really advocating for those participating or have participated in breast cancer clinical trials, providing BCT with the consumer perspective on relevant issues around the clinical trials program, things like recruitment, patient information consent forms, designing new trial protocols, any ethical issues that may be arising or could potentially arise with the research project. They raise community awareness in breast cancer clinical trials research and the research we undertake, and they represent consumer views on behalf of BCT for government, community, consumer and research forums, and promote the importance of clinical trials that we're undertaking. In terms of the Impact program, which is improving participation and advocacy for clinical trials, I won't go into this in much detail, but summarise to say that the primary, I suppose, aim around this program is really the education in the wider community around clinical trials research and enhancing the links between professionals and women who've participated in breast cancer trials. When we look at what the engagement looks like, well, again, it largely depends on what you want or need from your platform, but ultimately it needs to exist as a partnership. Not just look like one, but it needs to exist as a partnership between the researcher and the consumer and the community, such that the research that's generated reflects that partnership. And from BCT's perspective, when we look at our Consumer Advisory Panel in particular, we have representatives on our Scientific Advisory Committee as appointed representatives. They have seats on that board, on that committee. they review all of the concepts that come through BCT. Some representatives will then be assigned to those concepts that are endorsed for development. And they work closely with the Chief Investigator and members of the Concept Development Working Group to develop the proposal. That'll include grants and other materials associated with the conceptualisation of the project. They'll then work with the Chief Investigator and the operations team around developing patient materials, patient information consent, other materials that the patient may need or find relevant throughout the conduct of the study. Once the study's to the point where it's getting close to being able to be activated as a trial, the entire committee then would be involved in reviewing the penultimate trial protocol and the patient material. So we have an individual that's closely engaged in the development process, but then we have the entire committee involved to give that broader perspective of the project before it's launched. Following launch, the consumers are available to assist with HREC queries that may be coming through the application process or the submission process. We don't always have those queries come back, but when they do, a consumer involvement in answering those or responding to those is very important and useful. The consumers will be forming part of the trial working group or a part of the trial steering committee. It's important to have them involved in the continuation of the trial. They're involved in reviewing the information and any amendment that may be required, particularly relevant to participants either currently or in the future. And they'll assist with drafting the results documentations, the outcomes from the trial, and being able to translate those for the public. Outside of the clinical trial itself, so the individual clinical trial, our CAP's also involved in the organisation broadly. So they're very much contributors to our research strategy design and the overall organisation strategic plan. They provide consumer views on behalf of BCT for items such as government and regulatory consultative initiatives. And they participate in the communication and education programs of BCT for increasing BCT's exposure within the community. So just to wrap up quite succinctly, the consumer and community involvement can exist in multiple formats, and there's not a one-size-fits-all. It will largely depend on the clinical trial or the clinical trial program and the organisation and the organisation's size. But integration of consumers and the community in all aspects of the organisation's research program are achievable. We do it from start to finish at BCT in all aspects of our research program and our research direction. And it really should be because consumers should be involved in health research, particularly if that clinical that research could result in clinical implementation or informing policy as an outcome. So I'll just summarise by showing just some brief slides or information around resources that might be useful. I hope not to steal anyone's thunder here, but there's some items that I think could be useful, from understanding where networks exist, understanding what tools are available to researchers, and in particular, Anne McKenzie and the team at Telethon Kids have a good program established if you're looking to build education in and around your consumer group. So I'll stop it there and hand back to presenters.
Thanks so much, Heath. What a wonderful presentation. And I think you must have dropped 100 examples, concrete examples of the different ways that consumers can be involved at the micro level of an individual clinical trial all the way up to the organisation. So thank you very much. And your last slide is a perfect segue to our next speaker, who is Nicola Stratton, dare I say a colleague and personal friend of mine. Nicola and I share a passion for consumer involvement and have worked together on a number of projects. So it's my real pleasure to welcome Nicola. She is the Project and Engagement Manager for the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance, or ACTA, and I'll hand it over to Nicola. Thank you.
Thanks, Ange, and thanks everybody. It's great to be here today and just seeing so many familiar names and faces. So I'll just pop my slides up. Are they working okay? I'll move on because I'm very conscious of time. So I'm Nicola Stratton, the ACTA Project and Engagement Manager, and I'm a nurse researcher also. So I'm just going to share ACTA's programme that we've been working on for the last 3 years, strengthening consumer engagement in clinical trials, and real thank you to all the consumers and researchers who've helped deliver this work. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today, and there's lots of us here, so I'm sure many lands, on Gadigal land also, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend those respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So just briefly, ACTA, another acronym, but we are the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance, and we are the national peak body trying to support and connect and represent the investigator-initiated clinical trials sector, and members such as ANZUP and Leonie and Heath in the Breast Cancer Clinical Trials Network, so thank you so much. And what we're trying to do is bring those networks together, and I just wanted to put up, I guess, the last bold piece you see there. ACTA are trying to represent or support more than 10,000 clinician researchers, consumers, and the diverse research teams. So it's always amazing when I think of how many of us are out there together working to design and conduct the best clinical trials we can. So a brief summary, I guess, to kick off with. This is ACTA's consumer engagement activities for over the last 3 years now, and it's been a pleasure to work with Ange and many others to develop this work and deliver this work. So I guess over the last few years, we've also looked at international best practice around consumer involvement and continue to do so and share resources. We've conducted a national survey of the Australian research sector to try and understand consumer involvement in clinical trials, what's happening, where is everybody up to, and how best can ACTA try and help. And we'll talk to the toolkit in a moment. We've also delivered webinars and workshops with many of you and for many of you. We've worked on a clinical trial diversity project, which again I'll expand on in a moment. Looked at simplified and waiver of consent approaches in low-risk clinical trials with consumers. As we know, this is often a common challenge raised and experienced by many of us in the clinical trials sector and health sector. We've contributed to many consultations at a national and state and federal level, looking at different aspects, and in particular, I guess it's really pleasing to see the work of the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. I'm looking forward to hearing that discussed more. But what we've also tried to do as we've built relationships is really highlight the importance of consumer involvement in clinical trials. And you see a snapshot there, just of a couple of publications with Anne McKenzie and the team, Angela Todd and everyone. We published a paper, I think it was about just over a year ago, looking at COVID-19 pandemic research and the importance of consumer involvement. As this kicked off, I think some of what we're hearing on the ground is some consumers were actually left behind in the pandemic research. So again, we tried to highlight some challenges and some solutions to overcome that. And also we've recently been able to share our stories around clinical trial diversity, and the ABC picked up a piece. Many of you may know Lillian Lee, who is a feature of this story, really talking about how can we make clinical trials more inclusive and diverse. And it's just wonderful to work with some amazing consumers to develop this work. So again, just as I guess as Leonie and Heath both pointed out, this is a snapshot of the national survey that we did in 2018, I think it was. It's about to be published, hopefully in the coming months, led by Anne McKenzie. This really demonstrates the clinical trial life cycle. And as you can see here, consumers from our clinical trial networks and the research organisations we work with really told us that consumers were involved throughout the clinical trial life cycle. And still today, I often get asked, can consumers really be involved in, for example, data safety and monitoring boards? Yes, they can. I think we all know that. We just need to understand how we can work together to enable that to achieve the best results. And it was great to hear Leonie mentioning some of that. So I guess one of the things we realised early on was clinical trial networks and researchers are working with consumers to design and develop clinical trials, but the systematic how-to was maybe different for some more than others. As we know, a lot of the cancer clinical trial networks are amazing at this and really leading the way, and others are emerging and growing into this. So one of the deliverables we worked towards was the Toolkit, which was a co-designed and collaborative project. And I know a lot of people that we need to think about co-design when we say it. Was it truly co-designed? But this was a project I felt we really did come together as consumers and researchers. It was, as you know, developed by ACTA and CTIQ. It had national support, and we brought together a lot of the international resources. And I'll just briefly share this with you, as I know many of you may have used it. I hope you have. So this is the Toolkit. It's a digital platform, and the link is just down the bottom there. So we're hoping it will be an ongoing living repository to enable that systematic approach, but also a dip in, dip out approach. And it's primarily a toolkit for researchers and research organisations, but it does have a section for consumers on there, and I'll share that in a moment. And I'd just like to say, before I get into the behind the scenes of this, if you're a PhD researcher or a young researcher, all the way up to a clinical trial, I think there's something in this toolkit for everybody that you can take away and, you know, begin your journey. Even if you have started your study, it's never too late to involve and work with consumers. So just an example, and I'll put this all up to keep us moving along. Just as many of the panelists have spoken about, thinking about how to involve consumers and where to involve consumers and when. We've got some real practical discrete tools which can be downloaded, all free. Most of them are in Word or Excel, and you can take them away and start thinking about your consumer involvement journey. You can see here a planning worksheet, what questions to ask, and just as Heath was saying, think about when and where and how you want to involve consumers. We then have different tools which can be looked to help with the design and delivery of clinical trials. If you think about involving consumers in a clinical trial, what we found out from the survey that we conducted, on average, consumers are involved in a clinical trial for around 3 to 4 years as part of the study team. So thinking about building that into your budget in terms of reimbursing consumers is something we thought that probably should be looked into early on, and it's great to see now it's growing in the grant applications. So we have a consumer involvement cost calculator, which was actually brought from the UK. The Involve group in the UK developed this many years ago, and we reached out and asked for permission, and they allowed us to do this, and we just adapted it for the Australian audience. So you can see here, you can download it and start working on grant applications or study grant applications and projects. We also have a consumer involvement agreement, and that's to enable researchers to partners with consumers, I think, effectively. You know, set out the expectations, look to how you can be connected. And you heard me mention the pandemic research in which many consumers were left behind. Just making sure we're keeping those engagement channels going throughout our partnerships with consumers and researchers. We also have a poster, and I guess, you know, posters might be a thing of the past while we're all in these situations with the pandemic. But these posters can be designed and popped up in a clinic or in a hospital environment, but also on social media, as I guess many of us are connected in different ways now. And I often enjoy a good chat on social media with consumers and researchers. And lastly, just a brief snapshot of some of the toolkit resources. We have a consumer involvement pack, again, which was adapted from international resources that can be downloaded. Some great examples of how to be involved, especially when you're unsure. And just hearing Ben's story, Ben's taught me so much, but just to hear some of those, where you go to a meeting and there's 100 plus researchers and 12 of you in one room, hearing some of those stories, but understanding how you still can contribute, work with researchers as consumers. I think that's the most important thing. And we have some fantastic short videos of different consumers and researchers talking about their journeys together. And also what we're building on, small animations and fact sheets about what are clinical trials and what is randomization. And it's been great recently to convert one of the resources, What Are Clinical Trials, into 10 different languages, and also provide that as an animation and a fact sheet. And all of these resources are free to download and be used as you wish. And over the last few years, we've been working to implement these, and I'll just pop up this slide to say thank you to many of the organisations who've shared their experience with us. So just to move on quickly then, ACTA also recognised when it was conducting its consumer engagement programme the real lack of clinical trial diversity. And just to hear Anthony mention, you know, it's a human right to be involved, and I think expanding that even more so now. I think many of us know that there's a lack of diversity and inclusion of underrepresented groups in clinical trials, which impacts the generalizability of trial results and often can lead to the unmet healthcare needs of many end users. And we also know, I think, from our early research that we did in the survey, that there's actually limited diverse consumer involvement in clinical trials. So I think it's something for us all to reflect upon and think about ways we can improve this. You see here a very brief snapshot of some underrepresented populations within clinical trials, and this is as participants, but I guess we also need to think about this in terms of consumers working on advisory panels. And a real stark highlight of this was looking at people from CALD backgrounds, of culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. Although they make up a third of the population, they're often excluded from Australian research. And colleagues in 2019 looked at the National Register, the ANZ CTR Clinical Trials Register, and found that 42 of the 94 currently registered active dementia clinical trials in Australia excluded patients not fluent in English or participants not fluent in English. So that's a real highlight for all of us. And so ACTA heard this from our members and started to look at how could we address some of these challenges. And in 2019 and 2020, we conducted the CALD project, and you can look to our website to find all of these resources. But we sought to map initiatives across Australia, those initiatives by researchers and research organisations and consumers, seeking to, I guess, improve clinical trial diversity with and for people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. We've produced an environmental scan, built some great relationships with cultures from different diverse backgrounds, leading really up to a national clinical trial diversity workshop in 2020, when we brought researchers and policymakers and consumers together to look at the challenges and then hopefully some solutions. And the outcome of that, the first step, was to release a position statement to advocate for change in action. And this is only the beginning, but we're really hoping we can build on the awareness, involvement and access of clinical trials with and for people from CALD backgrounds. I guess we all know why it's important, but there really is a paradigm shift happening in clinical trial diversity. Many of you may be involved in this or recognise it also. But just to, again, take us back to the current times with the pandemic, this is a paper I read just recently. It was published in May this year. And what they found was that in phase 3 clinical trials, and this is in the United States, the median percentage of enrolled Black participants was 1.8 to 3.5%. And for those Asian participants, it was 0 to 7%. The Pfizer and Moderna phase 3 clinical trials, which I'm sure many of us are all benefiting from now, respectively enrolled 9.3% and 10.2% of Black participants, and 4.3 and 4.6% of Asian participants. So whilst this might be a slight increase, I think more could be done. And we've actually reached out to the clinical trialists who delivered this work and also the organisations that helped them. And I guess how is the paradigm shift coming? Well, this was a paper just published by the New England Journal of Medicine in September. Again, this recognition is now happening and the shift, I think, is coming. And from January 2022, they will require authors of research studies, as they need to prepare a supplementary table that outlines the disease, the problem or the condition and the representativeness of the study. So I think together we need to work to achieve this, and I think only with diverse consumer involvement can we do so. And ACTA's 2020 to 2024 programme will include a dedicated consumer engagement, equity and diversity work stream, and we'll look towards hopefully working with many of you in the future. And just to wrap up, just to say that consumers from the beginning have always shaped ACTA's programme of work, and it's really great, and I've learned a lot and hope that we can do so, as I said, more in the future.
Thank you so much. Look, it's clear that ACTA and you personally are doing a lot to provide some leadership in the clinical trials sector here in Australia. So really terrific. And again, concrete, tangible tools and resources that will be helpful to a lot of people. Thanks again, Nicola. We're going to shift gear a little bit now, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Warwick Britton from Sydney Local Health District and RPA, the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney. Warwick's going to share with us the experiences that they have had as a pilot site for the new national accreditation standards for clinical trials, which put a particularly strong focus on consumer involvement. So welcome, Warwick. Thank you so much for being here, and it's my pleasure to hand over to you.
Hi, so my name is Warwick Britton. I'm Research Director for Sydney Local Health District and Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. And I've been asked to speak briefly about the implications of the National Clinical Trial Governance Framework in the context of consumer and community involvement in clinical trials. This year, we were one of the 15 centres around Australia which participated in this process. And many may not be aware of this as yet, but the Council of Australian Government Health Ministers some years ago proposed this National Clinical Trial Governance Framework. And a trial was conducted between August last year and March of this year in 15 different centres. This is in the framework of the accreditation process from the Commission for Health Standards in Health Facilities. And so the clinical trial accreditation is around these two standards, clinical governance and partnering with consumers. Before I speak about the partnering with consumers, just emphasize that this is around the governance of clinical trials in health facilities. And in the pyramid, you'll see the health service organisation representing consumers, but clinical trials involving sponsors, a clinical trial workforce, health system managers, and the governing body. And I would just emphasise that this process for accreditation of health facilities to conduct clinical trials needs to engage every part of the health facility, not just the clinical trial investigators or a clinical trial unit. And partnering with consumers is at the centre of this governance framework. So the process involved review of the governance of clinical trials within a health facility, but also how consumers have been involved in that process. The second standard, partnering with consumers, in the context of clinical trials, has this aim that the organisation conducting clinical trials will involve consumers as partners in the planning, design, delivery, management, and evaluation of the systems that deliver clinical trials. In other words, the processes within the institution through which clinical trials are delivered, and will involve trial participants and patients as partners in their care. And there are a number of criteria around clinical governance, quality improvement systems. This is a quality improvement process, partnering with patients, health literacy, and partnering with consumers in the organisational design and governance. So this is not only around involvement of consumers in the clinical trial, but how they're involved in the organisation itself. In the context of partnering with consumers in clinical trials, there are a number of different action items, and I won't go into these in detail, but just to highlight, this moves from clinical governance through partnering with patients in their own healthcare. Health literacy are the communication systems used within the health facility effective at supporting partnership. Involvement, and just feeding from the last talk, the importance of the diversity of the community in clinical trials, And for example, in our own district in Sydney, we have over 100 different language groups in the population which we serve. Involvement of consumers in the development and review of information for patients and their family, supporting communication and in the structure. So this process, which is a substantial process, involves reporting back to the Commission following a series of guidelines that they provide. And in terms of its impact, it's essential that consumers be seen within the clinical governance and quality improvement systems that relate to trials and clinical research beyond the HREC. So this is really the extent to which consumers have input in the governance of the health facility itself. So this extends beyond the individual clinical trial to how the process is managed in the institution. Involvement of consumers in the design and development of clinical trials varies across the different types of clinical trials. And when we went through this pilot process, it was quite evident that consumer involvement in pharma-sponsored trials, as opposed to collaborative research groups, for example, many of the large collaborative oncology groups, to investigator-led clinical trials, where in general the local health system is the sponsor of the trial, and the involvement of clinical trial participants as partners in their care. So what are the requirements for undertaking this process? And I mention this because for many on the call will be involved in this over the next couple of years. The first point is this requires a commitment of the whole facility, not just the clinical trial support unit within a facility, from the board and the executive through to the participants. For us to fulfill the requirements of the pilot process, which will be substantially unchanged, we were fortunate to be able to appoint a full-time staff member to undertake the documentation, as well as our HREC and clinical trial staff. It was necessary to select 36 trials from 6 different clinical units to submit to the assessors, and from this they selected 6 clinical trials. And during the accreditation visit, which was done in March virtually, the assessors met with all layers of staff from the board right through the hospital administration to the clinical units, and they met clinical trial staff, participants in clinical trials, and the sponsors for 6 different clinical trials. So I'm indicating, and I won't go into detail, that this is a substantial body of work, and as an accreditation process, it is very document driven, and we submitted 398 different documents around this, but also in the visit, which involved 18 different sessions. And there was a cost involved this to the health system, which we estimated to be about $250,000. The accreditation assessment itself is across 18 action items in governance and 8 action items in consumer participation. And in each of these different items, the facility was rated as having initial systems which were present but did not fulfill the accreditation process, and established systems, which was the term used for the highest rating. And it was required that to be fully accredited, that you had to have established systems in each of these different 26 different areas. The pilot study was, as I said, a pilot study and the information was fed back to the Commission, and they have recently submitted a report on this. In the implementation phase, over the first 3 years, facilities will be rated on these scales and given time to improve. But after 3 years, facilities with clinical trial services will have to have established systems in each area. So what were the lessons that we learnt in this? Well, firstly, as I've emphasised, clinical trials is just not a matter of the individual unit conducting the trial. And all levels of the health service need to be engaged. It was critical for us to have, and we were fortunate to have senior clinical trial investigators involved in the process at each stage. This is a quality management system, and therefore you need to have expertise from a dedicated quality manager. And we were able to implement this across the system. Importantly, from our discussions today, we learnt that there were major differences in external pharma and investigator-led clinical trials in the involvement of local clinicians, but also consumers in the clinical trial development. So much of what we've heard today about clinical trial involvement of consumers relates to investigator-led trials, and yet a large part of our sector involves pharma trials. Again, we found that sponsors were willing to be involved in the review process, and we had external sponsors from pharma-led trials involved in the review process. And as has been highlighted and will continue to be highlighted, it was important to have consumer involvement in the planning and in the conduct of clinical trials, not just as participants. And consumers from each of the selected trials were consulted during the accreditation visit. An issue which we learned from is the processes for involvement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in clinical trials, how to encourage this and measure this. And this led to active discussions with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander service processes and a lead in our district. But there are factors which sometimes provide barriers to the involvement of people from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community in clinical trials. And how one measures this in routine clinical trials is not straightforward. What is the situation now? Well, there has been a review of the 15 different pilot sites, and a formal report from the Commission has been prepared and in fact was submitted to the Interjurisdictional Committee about the pilot program this week. There's been a revision to the governance framework, which is relatively minor, and this will go to the Council of Health Ministers, and I've no doubt will be endorsed. And there'll be implementation of this National Clinical Trial Governance Framework as part of hospital accreditation over the next 3 years from July 2022 against the maturity scale, which I showed. And if an institution doesn't reach the full maturity in each area, they will have time over to reach that. However, from 3 years' time, the standards in clinical governance and partnering with consumers, as in other accreditation process, will be assessed as met or non-met, and the facility given 90 days to remediate. So in summary, clinical trial governance, which includes partnership with consumers, will be mainstream and part of facility accreditation in the near future. So I'd like to thank our staff, particularly at RPA, who were involved in this, and I highlight the importance of having a quality manager in this process, which we did in Genevieve Watt, all the clinical trial participants and consumer representatives who were involved in our discussion. And this was not just consumer representatives for trials, but consumer representatives to the board, to our research and education committee of the board, and to each level of the facility, and our individual clinical trial units and administrators. So I'll be happy to answer any questions about this.
Thanks, Warwick, for your presentation. We're happy to take questions through the chat, which is now working, and have some time for a panel discussion. Very timely given the number of health services which we'll be needing to implement. So thank you for sharing your learnings. It's my great pleasure now to, we're going to flip down to Melbourne and to introduce Dr. Lisa Higgins. Lisa is a Senior Research Fellow in the Australian New Zealand Intensive Care Research Group in the School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine at Monash University. Thanks, Lisa, and over to you.
Thanks, Angela. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I work at the Australian and New Zealand Intensive Care Research Centre, where our core business is the conduct of large-scale multi-centre randomised controlled trials in critical care. And I've been working in critical care trials for nearly 20 years. And over that time, we've increased consumer engagement in our research. It has been and still is challenging, but I believe we conduct significantly better research as a result. However, I'd like to say that I'm not an expert in consumer engagement, and I simply want to tell you what we've done, how we've done it, what's gone well, and what our challenges have been and how we've overcome them. So just to start with a brief background to critical care, as it's a rather specialised area. So most people would know critical care as ICU, and it's just the specialised care of patients whose conditions are life-threatening or who require comprehensive care and constant monitoring. So that is, they're the sickest patients in the hospital. And they come to ICU with various diagnoses, perhaps post-cardiac arrest or severe trauma, burns, complex surgery. And the thing that links all of the patients is how sick they are. So in Australia, we have over 175,000 admissions to ICU every year. Median length of stay is only 1.7 days, so the majority of patients are only with us for a short period of time. And the mortality rate is 7.1%, so that equates to over 12,000 patients every year who die. So in critical care, we do a lot of clinical research. We do two main types. So we do clinical trials in specific patient groups where we look at interventions for those specific diagnoses. So that might be traumatic brain injury, sepsis, cardiac arrest, pneumonia, as examples. But we also do clinical trials in critical care interventions across patient groups and diagnoses. So this is where they are interventions that are commonly given to all patients who are critically ill. So you see some examples there: oxygen therapy, sedation, fluid therapy, mobilisation. But there are some really unique challenges associated with critical care trials. We have a really heterogeneous group of patients, and they can have very different outcomes depending on the reason for their admission. So for example, a patient admitted post-cardiac arrest is very different to a patient post-lung transplant or a patient with a severe infection. And we also have really unique challenges with consent. The majority of our patients can't provide informed consent for trials due to how unwell they are or their sedation levels. And so if we get consent at the time, it's typically the person responsible, which is usually a family member. And then the patient provides consent to continue when they become well enough to do so. So this is what ICU patients look like. And so consumers in critical care can differ in many ways from consumers in other areas. So as I've said, our patients are a very heterogeneous group with many different diagnoses. And as a result, they can have very different experiences and very different outcomes. At the time we encounter them, our patients, the majority can't communicate due either to the severity of their illness or delirium or their sedation levels. And for most of the patients, the admission is unexpected. So there's been no time to prepare. And they're often only with us for a very short time. So there's limited time for engagement. We also tend to have minimal contact with patients after discharge as they go on to be cared for by their parent team, whether that be trauma or respiratory, cardiology, for example. Our consumers are also the family members of patients in ICU. So critical care is a really challenging and very stressful time for families. They have a loved one who is very unwell, and the admission is often unexpected, such as following trauma or a cardiac arrest or a sudden deterioration due to infection. In ICU, changes occur rapidly, and there's usually very little time to obtain new knowledge and understand what's going on. So there's a piece in the New York Times which is called "My ICU Patient Lived, Isn't That Enough?" And previously in our trials, and in clinical practice too, we really did only look at mortality. But it's when we started speaking to patients, we realized that not only was mortality important, but recovery afterwards was really important to them. And there were significant impairments that remained after ICU. And that actually changed our research program. We now, in the majority of our trials, very much look at long-term outcomes. So we've had consumer engagement in many aspects of our clinical trials, from informing outcome choices, including core outcome sets, helping plan our research studies, involvement in grant applications, obviously serving on management committees, helping refine our trial documentation, and in helping communicate results. So as an example of how consumers have helped inform our research, our group did a qualitative study interviewing the survivors of ECMO. So ECMO is extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, and it's a way of supporting the heart and lungs when they're failing. So these are the sickest patients in ICU, and they have a high mortality. But from the qualitative research, we learned that deconditioning, immobility, and dependency was of great importance to ECMO survivors and their families. And so, recognising that this was a priority to our patients, we then developed a research program looking at addressing this priority. We developed the research program with consumers, and we've now successfully conducted a pilot study and have MRFF funding and are conducting a larger trial. We also have consumers involved in working out which outcomes we should be using in our clinical trials, and understanding that we have to move beyond what we previously collected, which was mortality and in-hospital measures, to understand the importance of longer-term outcomes and which outcomes mattered most to patients. We've also had consumer involvement in defining core outcome sets for ICU clinical trials. And so these core outcome sets inform what is collected globally in critical care clinical trials. So consumers have been involved in the majority of core outcome sets and really have a voice as to what outcomes are most important. And we aim to collaborate with consumers in all components of our trials. So that includes the trial design, the outcome measures we choose, and the time point at which we measure them, our ethics applications. And ethics is a really important component in critical care. Our interventions are often time critical. We rarely can get consent from patients. And for many of our interventions, we actually don't have time to get consent from a family member or the person responsible. So we often used opt-out consent or consent waivers or consent to continue. And it's been really important to have consumer engagement in these decisions to ensure that what we request is appropriate and is going to be acceptable to the people participating in our research. We also have consumers as investigators on our funding applications. And there's been some real challenges involved with this over time. The move to Sapphire, which is the NHMRC's grant management system, was challenging. We found, for example, that it didn't accept generic email addresses such as Hotmail, which was challenging when consumers use Hotmail addresses. So really had to work through some challenges with having consumers involved in funding applications. And it's really essential that we provide support and to our consumers when these challenges occur, and also feedback to the bodies involved. We're also beginning to have consumers involved in communicating the outcomes of our research. So these photos, which are shared with permission, are of one of our consumers, Shanna, when she was critically ill in intensive care. So she required ECMO, which I described earlier, and she was extremely unwell. And this is Shanna nearly 10 years later, and she's presenting at an international conference in front of 3,000 people, presenting with Professor Carol Hodgson, who's our Deputy Director of our Research Centre and leads our ECMO research. Someone who was involved in the research and who was in the audience for this presentation, it really showed me the impact that the consumer voice can have. The audience of 3,000 members was primarily clinicians, not researchers. And the feedback, particularly on Twitter at the time, was how much greater impact the talk had for those in the audience, hearing the results from a patient perspective. And I really think that this has taught us that involving consumers in conveying the message of our research can truly help with research translation. But there are some significant challenges associated with consumer engagement in critical care. So currently we don't have a standard method of finding critically ill survivors to act as consumers. So while many diseases have consumer groups, ICU is a location, not a disease. And there isn't a critical care consumer group in Australia. So our consumers may be members of a cancer consumer group or a heart disease consumer group, for example. We also have the challenge that some survivors don't wish to return to the stress they experienced during critical illness, both for themselves and their families. It really is a stressful time when people are critically unwell. So how do we engage consumers in critical care clinical trials? And it has been a real challenge. And typically it's through people involved, clinicians involved in the research, recommending someone to the group that they have had connection with in critical care. So it's really a direct approach method. It's also often people who've been involved in previous clinical trials that we've run who've expressed interest in helping or being involved in the future. But we'd really like it to be more representative. So one of the methods we're considering doing is, for many of our clinical trials, we do long-term follow-up calls for patients to measure things like quality of life. And one of the things we're considering is having a question at the end of that follow-up call about whether the person being interviewed would be interested in being a consumer representative for future research trials, which would enable us to have a register of consumers with lived ICU experience who are willing to be approached about possibly being involved. And the other challenge that we have is ensuring consumers have a voice. And this has really required training for those who are leading the research. It's very easy, especially in a field like critical care, to speak in medical terms that are not easily understood by consumers. And it's essential that the time is taken to train the members of the research team and the consumers to really ensure that we can have an effective partnership. So just briefly, as we don't have much time left, I just wanted to say that we have truly seen the benefits of consumer engagement in our research programs. I believe we now ask better questions, we conduct better studies, and that gives us greater confidence in our study results. And I think we also, through our engagement of consumers, have a much greater likelihood of translating our study results, which is really the end game. And that's me trying to keep to time. So I'd be very happy to be contacted if anyone has any questions or any questions in the chat. Thanks, Angela.
Lisa, thank you so much. A terrific presentation highlighting the challenges in some of our most acute settings in health services. Thank you so much. Our final presentation for this morning's webinar is going to provide an industry perspective, and it's my great pleasure now to hand over to Peter Murphy. Peter is the Country Head of Communications and Patient Engagement for Novartis in Australia and New Zealand. Thanks for joining us, Peter. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Angela, thank you everyone, and thanks for the invite to speak. Look, it's I realise I'm at the end of the day or the session for us, so I'll try and go quickly through the slides. I've only got a few slides to present, but I think just to frame a presentation, I'm here to speak briefly about the industry perspective, and Novartis is my company that I've been with for 15 years, and in the industry for about 20 years. So it's certainly seen a huge shift over the years, and I think that's increasing. Of course, I've got to say, as a natural bias, I've got a bit of a say that we are somewhat leading in this way, but I'd certainly say that we're also, as an industry, coming off a low base. And we've got to acknowledge other friends in the pharmaceutical industry that are doing similar things to this, so I want to acknowledge that. But just to go into some context just quickly, is just to take them from our industry association with us in Australia, just to put the context around, about a third of our clinical trials in Australia are industry sponsored, and I was actually surprised to read that equates to about $1 billion of investment each year, which includes the people we employ to manage the trials in Australia. And we have about 30 to 40 people in our company in Australia initiating, managing, and closing those clinical trials, and they do fantastic work across the country. Obviously, COVID made it interesting over the last few couple of years with that. But the majority of our development work is actually done in our global office in Switzerland and in the US. So, I mean, I've got a personal passion for consumer involvement generally, and I've been a strong advocate internally, but I think it's I'm excited by the direction that it's taking. So I can talk a little bit more about that. So this really demonstrates the whole gamut of opportunities where consumers can get involved in the life cycle of a medicine. I think predominantly you'll probably be aware that in the industry focus has been predominantly at the second half of this part of this slide. But I think more and more so, industry is really looking at the earlier stages, the earlier starts of this, and we've really made a big effort. And certainly over the last 4 or 5 years, there's a significant shift to embedding this the consumer and community voice in the drug development process at the start. So I mean, it's interesting because in preparation for this presentation, I was actually speaking to one of my colleagues in the US, who's in the global patient engagement team, and he gave me some insights about where there's been a really significant shift in mindset from inside the company, which is really great to hear, because we have obviously the start of the very science discovery development side. We have mostly medical field science backgrounds, and they spent all their careers solely thinking doctors, solely that's been their way. And I think it's been interesting to hear what my colleague was saying about there's been a circuit breaker in the changing of the mindset, and they're a lot more open to bringing the consumer in earlier. And as I was saying, my colleague was saying that once they are exposed to people inside the company, once they're exposed to the experience and the consumer involvement, they want more. And it's interesting, in fact, with my team, even in Australia, and the global team, we're actually experiencing huge demand internally for bringing the consumer into the organisation and having that perspective. And move on to the next slide. So this has been really what's driven a lot of this. So about 2018, we announced this, and this is a publicly available commitment to patients and caregivers. And I'll talk a little bit about what this is. So there's 4 pillars of this commitment. Really, it's good to see that clinical trials is one of those pillars, but I think the consumer is involved in all of these particular parts of this. It's relevant for the whole all 4 pillars. I mean, one of the things when I was talking to my colleague, he was saying at the start of this, there were about 20 distinct projects which involved the consumer and the community in the drug development process. Now, this year, apparently, there's going to be 100 distinct projects in the company that are actually involved with the consumer. So it's great to see, and that's really the top 3 areas are kind of trial, plain language trial summary, protocol trial design, informed consent, and we're also growing the engagement through mapping the journeys of patients through market research methodologies, and also to Nicola's point earlier, we actually launched earlier this year our commitment to the diversity in clinical trials. So, and that's available on our website. I think one of the things that's been driving a lot of this is public accountability. If we put it on our website and say we're going to do it, we've got to do it. So it's important that's really helps to drive a lot of what's happening in the company. And I think one of the most encouraging things is that we're starting to see colleagues in the drug development process actually go at the very, very start. And what the questions that they were going to ask the doctors and the investigators about is the strategy right? Where are the gaps? Those are the questions we're actually asking the consumers now. It's not perfect, and we're not by any means perfect, but it's certainly starting to happen. So I'll try and go quickly through to the last slide. So really,
Peter, I might just, the audio is still not great.
Is it still bad? I'm sorry. Usually I'm quite good with this, but maybe I'll close now and leave you on the slide for further information. And you can, please feel free to contact me if there's any information through LinkedIn, and I can help with any questions.
Peter, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we had some challenges with the audio there, but terrific to hear an industry perspective, and also how important consumer and community involvement is to industry, to stakeholders. Everyone, we've had some terrific presentations today. We've heard so many different diverse perspectives. Our presentations have run a little over time, and we just feel that rather than try and do a very rushed panel discussion now, some of the questions that have come through in the Q&A really require some consideration. And so what we'd like to propose is that we actually schedule a follow-up event where we'll invite our speakers to join us again, and we'll dedicate some time to really exploring some of the questions that have come through in the Q&A in some depth. What I'd like to do is just hand back to Helena to perhaps provide just some reflections on this morning's session as we wrap up. Thanks. Over to you, Helena.
Thanks very much, Angela. Always the challenge of so many brilliant presentations and great comments in the chat, and we have captured them all. So the aim would actually be to, as we said, to bring back that panel discussion and to have the opportunity to have to address some of those points. I think that in my own experience, just from a personal perspective as a clinical trialist, but also as a health service improvement and health services research implementation researcher, I don't think I could do my job anymore without significant, genuine consumer partnership, or actually I call it community partnership. In our own experience as Monash partners, not only do we train and actually enable and support researchers, clinicians and consumers in this space, and Angela Jones leads a lot of this work, but actually also provide mentoring and support for teams to get together. We can read all the resources and support strategies and toolkits, and they're all really important, but sometimes it's just that personal interaction and coaching that becomes really important. And once a team's off and running, they're often off and running. And in our experience, one of the best things we've done is really to make it a cultural change around engaging with and partnering with the community in the work that we do, actually from the outset. And that means sometimes the clinical trials, and as a trialist I can say this, is not necessarily the answer to the problem. Sometimes when we sit together with our consumers and actually sort out the problem, sometimes a conventional controlled randomized trial may not be the ultimate answer to the problem. Sometimes there are other methodologies, or sometimes the nature of the trial might actually be quite different. So I suppose I'm just going to finish here by challenging everyone to think even further back than engaging consumers in the governance and the co-design of your trial, to actually engaging with the community about the nature of the problem you're trying to solve. And we had some good examples of the problem from our critical care speaker. But I think that if we actually go back to genuinely thinking about research as a Trojan horse or as a tool to deliver health impact, then sometimes actually going back to the problem and understanding the problem ideation from all of our stakeholders is really important, because the whole nature of what we design right from the outset may be different. And when you hit that sweet spot, not only does perhaps what you're designing change, but the solution is fit to purpose and is pulled in by the end user, instead of us worrying about the 17 years of delay in the translation of the results. So just for a bit of an even more severe paradigm shift than what we're talking about today. So thank you all to the brilliant presenters. Thanks to Sydney Health Partners, Angela Todd, Monash Health Partners, Angela Jones for bringing this together, our great consumer speakers from Consumer Health Forum, and many of the others who've participated, and the brilliant numbers who've engaged on here. So I really think this is a part of a national initiative under the Consumer and Community Involvement platform with the Academic Health Science Centres or Research Translation Centres, and also in partnership with ACTA, and great work. So thank you very much to Angela Todd and Angela Jones. I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Helena, for your comments. It's been a great pleasure to work with Sydney Health Partners. Working together has been terrific. I just would like to thank our speakers for their time, for their insights and their generosity today. The comments through the chat have been overwhelmingly positive about the quality of the presentations, and thank you to all. We really appreciate you making the time available today, and also we look forward to continuing conversations. I think clearly there's enormous interest and opportunities for us all to continue to work together. I'm going to hand over to Angela in a minute to make some closing remarks, but when you close out of today's session, there will be a very brief survey that pops up. We greatly appreciate if you had just take a minute or two to complete it. One of the things we're most interested in is areas of interest for future sessions going into 2022. So any insights you could provide there would be greatly appreciated. And Angela, I'll hand over to you to close out.
Thanks, Angela. Angela and I do get along together, not just because we're both called Angela. We have a meeting of the minds around a lot of things, another great partnership. To everyone, thank you again for your time and your wonderful comments in the chat and on the Q&A. Really appreciate it. We will go through them line by line because they will help inform the future programs that we'd like to develop together. As Angela said, we'd really be thrilled if you could take the time to fill in the evaluation form. I'd also like to sincerely acknowledge Monash Partners has done a lot of work in managing the back end of all of the operations today. So again, Angela, Victoria, Sandy, and of course Helena, thanks again for your support, and we really do thank you all for your interest in the important topic of involving consumers in clinical trials. It is genuinely an area and a passion for all of us that are on this call, and again, great speakers, great diversity, great chats, and we look forward to welcoming you at future events. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.